Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, where we will be discussing the historic announcement by the US Supreme Court in the United States to reverse Roe v. Wade and change Americans' abortion laws from being a federal law, which the whole of the United States is entitled to abortion, to allow the individual US states to decide whether to ban abortion or keep abortion. So this is a great victory for American Christians who have prayed, who have interceded, who have campaigned on this issue, and we'll be asking what is a British response to what we've seen across the pond in the United States of America. And in this programme today, I'm joined by Melanie Simmons, who is the editor of Heart newspaper, together with the Reverend Mark Whedon from Living Word Ministries. So welcome to the programme. Before we kick off on this absolutely incredible historical story of incredible significance, the Supreme Court, with its conservative judges overturning Roe v. Wade. Everyone thought that that was near impossible. But before we get into this important discussion, you have a new edition of Heart newspaper. So this is the agreement that I have with Melanie, that she comes on the programme. She wants to talk through her latest newspaper, and that's why it should be this case, because we need to support Christians on the front line, and Melanie's on the front line and does a great job with Heart newspaper. So there you go. Over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Well, this is our June-July issue. Been out for a month or so already. Got a wonderful testimony on the front, a former soldier who talks very clearly about how he came to Jesus, and he really was at rock bottom, suicidal, alcoholic, etc. And it's an insight as well into what army life can do to people, and it's particularly topical at the moment with war in Europe. We've also got another article by Pastor Chris Wickland, the one who his church has a field that they've planted because the Lord told him, feed my sheep. So there's a follow-up article talking about the coming financial crash and how Christians can prepare for that. We've also got another an article by Tony Pierce, World Falling Apart or Coming Together, and lots of people are fans of his Light for the Last Days. He also talks about the coming digital currencies and also the pandemic preparedness treaty, which the World Health Organization was threatening. It's been kicked down the road for a bit, but it's still there, and it's still imminent as far as we know. It's one of those things that doesn't get reported. And we also have Charles Gardner, super report on the recent historic service of repentance at Oxford Cathedral over our anti-Semitic laws, which were passed in 822, I think. 1222.
800th anniversary.
800th anniversary, thank you. Things move fast, yes. And last but not least, we've got a half page on 7 essentials to get to prepare now, which a lot of people are taking seriously.
And of course, Gordon Petty does your book reviews as well.
Oh, yes.
There you go.
Yes.
And you didn't feature this for this summer edition then, Mark?
No, not at all.
Right, so Melanie, I'll start off with you. I mean, what is your response to this historic decision by the US Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade? I think most Christians, if they're honest, felt that this the federal laws in America regarding abortion would never be overturned. There was always that hope that one day this could happen, but it's happened, and the Supreme Court have made a brave and courageous and, can I say, biblically correct decision to preserve life. What are your thoughts on this incredible ruling by the US Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade?
I agree with you. It is amazing, and it's a tribute to the US Christians who must have been fasting and praying over this, because that's the only way that you get a result like that is through prayer and fasting. It was the same with Brexit. It was the same with the election of President Trump. These are supernatural results. You cannot explain them in the natural because it goes completely against the groundswell of the media, the bombardment that we get with the BBC and that they would have with their secular news stations.
Mark, I just want to bring you into the equation, because there's one thing I like about you very much is that you are prepared to deal with controversial issues where most pastors today decide, not most, but a lot of pastors decide today to duck away because it might bring division. But you actually gave a sermon in your church, didn't you, on the historic decision made by the US Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade. How important is it from a pastor's perspective that pastors talk about current affairs, talk about difficult social issues and don't duck them? Because if you're going to prepare the flock, then you have to prepare them for the backlash and possible persecution that will come as a result, but also to talk about these important issues such as abortion in the church.
I think it is very difficult for pastors to talk about these things because you get a backlash within the church. It's perceived to be difficult or hard or an area that people don't want to go down, and you lose people in your congregation. You can do. But the Apostle Paul was very clear, and he said, I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole counsel of God. And he was aware that as pastors, preachers, we have an accountability to Almighty God, which is far greater than our congregations or human beings or governments, and that we are his spokesman. And so we need to declare the things that God is giving us. And part of being a preacher is actually to know the mind of God and to hear what the Holy Spirit wants to say to people. And so we can't duck these issues. We have to take them, put them carefully, because it's people, it's human beings, and all of their sort of fears and their circumstances and the pressures that they have in their lives. But we still have to gently and carefully say what God's mind is in these difficult areas.
No, absolutely. And who would have thought, really, Melanie, that these Conservative judges, we had a leak report by one of the Liberal judges that the court was going to decide to do this, to overturn Roe v. Wade, which created a kind of backlash, I think, after that potential decision that they were preparing for this. But to actually then go ahead and do that, despite the risks to their own judges' own personal safety, because we've seen the Liberal backlash. And this comes at a time also spiritually and politically, at a time when there were no Christians having access, evangelicals, to the White House, no influence on President Biden and his administration whatsoever. A time that under Trump, Christians would pray for Trump, they would pray for Mike Pence, was a born-again believer, so was Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, and others in the administration, very high up, were born-again believers. But we're dealing with a very kind of liberal, progressive administration. And to think that they hold both houses of Congress, both the Senate and the Congress, and in terms of US politics, have virtually absolute power during this term in office. But out of this has come this incredible ruling by Roe v. Wade. What does this say about the providentialness of God and God's providence?
It says everything, that God is He's all-powerful, and when people turn to him and appeal to him, he will have mercy. I find it hard to believe, because it reminds me again about Brexit, because it's God giving a nation a second chance. And talking about Mark's sermons, about 2 weeks ago, he also preached about judgments which have been prophesied over America. And then shortly afterwards, we get the Roe v. Wade overruling. It's quite extraordinary. And actually, if people contact Heart Publications, they can find out how to sign up for the messages, because I really think they should hear last week's on Roe v. Wade, because he really took the ruling apart and what it means. But it's extraordinary, because it looks like God's redemption for America, or certainly for those states which are now going to introduce laws where they're going to ban abortions, where the baby has a heartbeat, all these things. But by the same token, there is a huge challenge to the church, which Mark touched on in his sermon, because it's a question of whether the church is prepared. Now, perhaps the church in America, where they have bigger houses, is more prepared to take in women who are going to have a baby nonetheless. If I can do another quick plug. Back in, a couple of decades or more so ago, I was commissioned by SPUC. They have they had an evangelical wing, because the Catholics overall have been better on abortion than the evangelicals, but there's a small evangelical section. And they asked me to write up these testimonies of women who regretted their abortions. And that was quite a harrowing experience. And I'm not sure that much has changed since then in terms of our preparedness in the church to help women. It means if we're serious about this, we've got to put our money where our mouths are. We've got to be ready to open our homes, as well as having counselling programmes in preparation. And one of the things that I was pleased about with the recent Missing Millions event, which was put on last November in the Emmanuel Centre by Brenda Taylor and Linda Rose, was that they had counselling available, is something I was slightly involved in the planning, for women who had regrets. This is the big thing. There are women in churches who haven't been properly ministered to, who haven't received the Lord's forgiveness, and there is this kind of facility available, but it's not widely known.
Absolutely. Mark, I have to ask you as well, because I think it's important to get God's perspective on the issue of abortion, primarily because there is so much confusion even within the Christian ranks, and many liberal Christians hold a certain view and other conservative Christians hold another view. So what is God's perspective on abortion? And also, can you just talk through how the killing of innocent blood brings a curse upon the land, and how this is something that is so grieves the heart and character of God?
Jesus said very simply that it was the thief who came only to steal and to kill and to destroy, but I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. And we see in Psalm 139, when David is considering the way that God gave him life and that he was in the womb and God knit him together in the womb. We understand medical processes, but we've not really considered what's behind those processes. And it's the Almighty, it's the Creator. And then in Psalm 127, it speaks of children are a reward, they're a gift from God. And so through the Bible, you will see this assumption that pregnancies are expected to go to full term. The Bible mentions miscarriages, but it doesn't mention abortion. And so that's the kind of heartbeat. And then with God speaking to Jeremiah and calling him, God said, before you were in the womb, I knew you. And you piece together that and the plans and purposes God has for us. God has a purpose for life because he knows the end from the beginning. He sees the future. I mean, in a little simple way, he knows what the next word in our tongue is going to be before we've even thought it or spoke it. And so he's got this purpose for life, and we're trying to hinder those purposes by the ways that we act. And we can understand people's circumstances and the pressures they may feel, but we need to get God's mind and help people to understand God's mind, even in the church, because many in the church, like you said, don't embrace this truth. But God is for life, from inception right through to the end.
Absolutely, thank you for giving that explanation. And Melanie, if we take, for example, the Christian conservatives in the United States, I think there was probably a lot of complacency in the 60s and 70s regarding the kind of liberalisation of our Western societies and the slow dismantlement of our Judeo-Christian heritage. There were some brave individuals who stood up against this liberal tide of liberalism, which effectively was designed to break down our Judeo-Christian heritage. Now, we've seen a response from conservatives in America, Christian conservatives, where they've made the issue of abortion an issue that the Republican Party had to adopt. So in other words, he's saying, if you want our vote, which is the Christian evangelical vote, or even the Catholic vote, then this is dependent upon you over getting rid of abortion. And that is what's gone mainstream. So of course we saw with President Trump, the first US president ever to speak up for the unborn in the United Nations. He said before in his election campaign of 2016 that he was going to appoint conservative judges if he had the chance to overturn Roe v. Wade and get rid of abortion in the States. How important is it that Christians in this country can learn something from our fellow brothers and sisters of Christ in the United States to see how they've handled this and what we can learn from their lesson in campaigning on this issue? Because surely this is something that we should be using come elections for our MPs to raise this issue because it's so important, rather than to get Boris's response, which he said this is a step backward.
I think it's completely important. I'm just wondering as you speak if it would work exactly the same here, because we don't have PR, proportional representation, it's first past the post, and we can each lobby our own MP, and it seemed to, I have the impression more that Christians can lobby their own MP. I mean, we saw recently, though, you say about the Republicans, who broadly equate to the Conservatives here, when we had the vote on whether to continue the DIY pills, abortion pills sent to people's houses, there was a very helpful list published in Christian Voice magazine, and I went through it, and we then started adding them to our list for free copies of Heart Paper. But it was mainly Conservatives who voted against it. Now, whether that's because they had more active constituents lobbying them about the issue, or whether it was just because they're minded that way anyway, I wouldn't know. But the trouble is, it is an election issue, and all three parties have tried to appear to be sort of politically correct on this, in the same way as they all try to out-green each other. They sort of try to show how, dare I say, anti-life they are, and, you know, and sort of vote calling it a women's rights issue. And I just want to make one other point about it's the legal side. There's a Catholic bishop or archbishop on the radio who's given some airtime on the BBC, which isn't that often, but he said that legally an unborn baby always counted as a life. So if a pregnant woman died in a car crash, it would count as 2 lives lost. And I think most people would see that. So there's this rank hypocrisy which needs to be shown. In the same way we talk about health care for women to dispose of unwanted babies, but it's not care for the unborn baby. So it needs to be seen to be another life, and we do need to talk to our MPs about this.
Mark, what's your reaction from Boris Johnson? Because when this news broke last Friday, of course, dominated our kind of news headlines, shock around the world, and our own Prime Minister gave an interview only a couple of days ago to CNN. He's together with other world leaders, such as the French President Emmanuel Macron, condemning this decision, together with the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and even the Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. But this is what he says. So it says the Roe v. Wade judgment, when it came out, was of huge psychological, let me repeat that. The Roe v. Wade judgment, when it came out, it was of huge psychologically important for people around the world. And it spoke about the advancement of rights for women. And he said, I regret what seems to be a backward step. And then he went on to say, I want to be very clear about that. He said, I think the United States, for me, it remains a shining city on a hill. It's an incredible guarantee of values, democracy, freedom around the world. And also he says that he doesn't think that the rollback of abortion rights hurts America's role as representing of rights and freedoms. What do you make of his response to the decision by the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade?
Well, I think he's right in that it's an earthquake that has shockwaves around the world. It's been huge. There's a lot of misunderstanding, though, because many people think that the justices have banned abortion, which they have not. All they've done is turned the issue over to the individual states and to the democratic process and debate, and people can sort of lobby their electors and all those sorts of things. So it's not banned, it's there, people can travel. But I think it was well put really by a young lady who was a nobody in terms of profile and office or anything like that. But speaking of Roe v. Wade, she said that went from safe, legal and rare to up to the moment of birth. We gave you an inch and you took a mile. And of course, this is not about women's health where there's a threat to the mother's life. In the United States, the issue is right up to birth, where abortion can legally take place, which is an extraordinary thing. So if he's calling that a backward step, then his thinking needs to adjust, because this is way beyond what was brought in. If you want to just look at the politics and the law at the time and the medical understanding at the time, it was perceived to be something that would be occasional, and it would be when the mother's life was at risk. Now it's for all kinds of social reasons or apparent psychological reasons. So I think the Prime Minister is out of touch really with the real issue. What's your reaction to the extreme liberal response? I mean, we've had young people yelling and screaming and swearing in absolute rage, as if saying that this guaranteed right to abortion and to have abortion has been taken away from them. And thinking that this is a step back for women, this is a step back for the choices that women can make. But the reality, if we take a step back from that and just think about it,
is the fact that there seems to be a complete disconnection in their mind between what is a baby and what's not. So it all depends. If you want to keep a baby, then it's a baby. But if you don't want to keep it, then it becomes a fetus. But I mean, are we living in an age now where rationale, reason, and science are going out of the window in place of emotional arguments that are not backed up by facts or science?
Yes, well, it was ever thus. I mean, I remember when I was first got involved with SPUC to write that book, and at that time they're talking about extending the limits on abortion in this country, and SPUC funded and sent each MP a life-size model of made out of whatever some kind of plastic or something, and they sent all 600 MPs, I think there's 600 then, this life-size model of the representing the unborn baby at the age that they were going to vote on for it to be terminated. And the reaction of the MPs was how disgraceful this was and how shocking the fact that SPUC had done this, because they'd been confronted with this reality. I mean, much like, you know, if people might react after a visit to an abattoir or something, they still want to enjoy the meat on their plate. But it's what made the news was their shock and outrage and the offence that they had taken over being presented with the truth. And it's still the issue. And I think the shock and it's a fearful reaction from young people, because they can see it's a threat to their way of life, because they have grown up. And I grew up much like this, with the idea that there was sexual freedom, and if you got into a position you didn't want to be in other words, if the contraception failed and you got pregnant, then you could have an abortion. You wouldn't want to, but you would, because you wanted to get on with your university and career and all the rest of it. And that is how, for the last, 30, 40 years, young people have grown up. And so they see this as a threat to their way of life. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, how come you know, in the 21st century, there still isn't effective contraception? And deep down, the very small answer, quiet answer is perhaps women want to have babies.
So something definitely to think about and ponder there, Melanie, thank you. Mark, I suppose the other thing we have to bring into the equation now is that, look, the Conservative judges on the US Supreme Court have had a massive victory. This is a massive victory for evangelical Christians in the United States who have prayed, who have interceded on this issue, who have campaigned for the Republican Party to have this overturning v. Roe v. Wade, which has almost been in place for 50 years, almost exactly. And now it's overturned and it's now been given to state level. Is there not a backlash now? Because we're seeing now that the hatred that hard left liberals had towards evangelical Bible-believing Christians was bad enough, but now has it got worse? In a sense, the anger and the hatred now has emerged, and now we are the direct target of the hatred and vengeance.
Yes, I think that is so, because when I mentioned about it being an earthquake, it's opened up a fault line and polarized people further. It's divided America further. And it's not to say that the justices shouldn't have made the ruling they did. I believe they were right to do so. And really, it's more of a legal ruling, as I touched on, rather than a moral ruling. But it has these huge consequences. And so their church has been burnt down. Pro-life clinics have been attacked. And you already mentioned one of the justices having an assassination attempt. I think it will continue, because behind this you've got a spiritual battle going on, and there's a spirit of death as well as a spirit of life, and that spirit of death will look to work out in whatever area it can. So I think it will continue for a long time.
Melanie, we're down to the last less than 4 minutes of the programme. The fact that the US Supreme Court have made this decision, followed by possibly 19 US states, if not more, to actually outlaw abortion completely. Do you think this marks a spiritual turning point for America and the West? And if America leads the way, you know, could this happen here? Because I think other countries that have pushed back on the abortion laws have been Poland, and a few other, and a South American country as well. So do you think this could set a new precedent and a reminder of Christians to get involved in politics, but also to pray for our politicians, those involved, and see what happens when we make a stand for righteousness for God?
Yes, certainly. I was quite the fact that America's done this and it's news around the world should embolden Christians, and I don't think Christians should be put off by the media reports and why I fear civil war in America, etc. One very interesting point is that Margaret Sanger, who was gave birth to the organisation which became Planned Parenthood, which has had its own notoriety in America because of baby parts, she had specified that clinics should be in black and Hispanic areas, abortion clinics, because she saw their lives as having less value. So this is actually a racist issue as well, which Christians are grasping, and it should not be the first resort for poorer people. But the big challenge is, what are we going to do about it, Christians here? And there is talk now, I'm pleased to say, about a National Day of Prayer by the same team which is behind the Missing Millions Day. Annual March for Life, 3rd of September, that's every year. They're talking about on the 27th of October, which is an anniversary of the Abortion Act from 1967, and that there will be a candlelight vigil in Parliament Square. That's approximately also the date when we will hit the 10 million abortions figure in this country. I think America's figure is about 260 million. But the sad thing is, in this country, well, perhaps like America, where it's happened under Biden, although Trump set it up with the Supreme Court, we can't appeal to our heads of government. People have appealed to the Prime Minister, they've appealed to the Queen for National Day of Prayer. One person has voiced a hope that Prince William might be willing to call for Day of Prayer if we have food shortages.
So Melanie and Mark, thank you so much for joining me for this week's edition of Politics Today, where we've discussed this historic decision by the US Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade, America's federal abortion laws, and allowing the states to make that decision. And I think it marks a spiritual turning point for the history of the United States and also for the West, that if this can happen in America, then it can happen here. And that's why as Christians we need to be bold, and we need to stand up for the unborn and campaign on this issue by praying, by interceding, and also speaking to our political representatives. So I want to thank you for watching this week's Politics Today.